Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am representing Development Reimagined, an African-led, women-led international development consultancy. I would first like to warmly thank Jason and the entire AfCoDD team for allowing us to organize this discussion today. I'm very honored to be moderating this session on the topic of driving economic transformation through increased African borrower coordination. We have an incredible lineup of panelists, which I will introduce very shortly. But before we get into that, I would like to bring to the stage Professor Aziz Salmon, who is a political scientist at the Guerrilla Group of Research and Initiative for the Liberation of Africa, to give the keynote remarks. Sir, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aziz Salmon Fall, and on behalf of all the members of the Group for Research and Initiative for the Liberation of Africa, I welcome you to Dakar, the land of my birth, where you are all at home. In our culture, the hand that gives subordinates, but when we borrow, we return without interest. Otherwise, it's a gift. Our value may have changed, but there are still hints in our African identity, and unfortunately not yet in our unity. As the rest of the planet, we are victims of monetism being money. And as a Pan-Africanist, I have a vision that may reassure some of you or offend others, and I already apologized. I am convinced that if Africa were one and spoke with one voice on financial matters, on development, things would be very different, and that we would not be gathered here in a chic foreign hotel graciously enjoying the space of the Dakar coastline. It's exactly what the representative of the African Union mentioned. We have very little political will. Most of our countries are not even paying their fees at the African Union. And at this stage, the global economic crisis has been exacerbated by many external factors. The US Federal Reserve raised their interest rate, along with the Bank of England and the European Central Bank. And this led to repatriation of more than 10% of credit. More and more debt payments are being suspended in the last 3 years. 9 countries have defaulted. So we are in a very gloomy situation where, as you know, the peripheries have even their own share of very rich people. So yes, some people are very wealthy in the continent. We have been open to globalization. And but we are still facing the same greed and the same insatiable steamroller. And the question here is whether African borrowing countries can stand united on the eve of the MDG summit in September or the forthcoming World Bank and IMF annual meeting in Marrakesh in October. We need to speak with one voice and act together in a coordinated way in the common interest of our people. Union makes the strength of even weak for resources, said Erasmus. Maybe some of you remember, but on July 29, 1987, Thomas Sankara, echoing Fidel Castro in '85 at the UAE summit, called for a united front in Addis Ababa against the debt. He asked his peers and borrowers to stand united and refuse to pay the debt and cancel it, saying that whoever could pay, it should go and pay in the next day. But if we refuse to pay, the creditor clearly will not die, but if we pay, we will die. Everyone applauded, hilarious, and 3 months later, he was assassinated. Along with 22 lawyers, after 25 years of fighting, I prosecuted and convinced some of these killers. But the main one, despite of this conviction, is still protected by the financial sector in Abidjan. What Sankara fought for is still in the agenda: Pan-Africanism, sovereignty, and for borrowers to be united and fight for development that benefit their people. Maybe some of you learned that in the 50s, Some of our own technocrats were sent in Washington to learn some of the technology of the new management strategies. They were fed with the idea of Rostov and Cairncross, and Cairncross argued that countries would start as new borrowers, evolve into advanced borrowers, and eventually become new lenders. This mirror was maybe the possibility of becoming a rentier, and we became caught up in this debt strategy. The question here, and we really lack of time because we need to understand how those clubs and cartels are organized and how we can organize ourselves in a different manner. It is true that we have technically already clubs, even though they are not formal clubs, like the G27, the non-aligned movement, etc. But what we need here is a consortium that would be a borrowers consortium, that would be a supranational African partnership and cooperation entity to strengthen their negotiating power and the execution of one of more economic repayment and loan operation. It would act through consortium agreements with each donor and creditor. It would demand to participate, for example, within the Paris Club in the negotiation that concerns them. And we can look very sympathetically at the proposal of Development Reimagined, which suggests a borrowers club based on the trust of the participant and taking over the microfinance strategy of Grand Mine with strong coordination enabling loans to be taken out collectively. The consortium, however, would first have to agree internally on public finance management, how to secure and use resources effectively, efficiently, and transparently, how to curb corruption, capital flight, tax evasion, poor governance, and so on. But then the consortium could carry out an audit of debt and initiate broad mobilization for sovereign repudiation of odious or illegitimate debt. It could ensure concerted action to borrow intelligently, promote debt sustainability and transparency, how to borrow without risking over-indebtedness, vary the source of financing and loans, and maintain a scale of interest rates and conditionality that are economically and socially bearable for our population. It could actually also set up a bridging insurance mechanism in the event of non-repayment for very serious reasons. We can even invoke the suspension or cancellation of repayment on the ground of necessity, for example, when international legal provisions such as a fundamental change in circumstances that is not the fault of the debtor. We can also resist borrowing and trading in foreign currencies, having a fight to have our own currency. We can propose, and this maybe we can dream of, but we can propose a World Bank that lends without interest and for projects and programs that respect people and the environment. Work for an IMF that curbs financial speculation by banks, fraud, and tax evasion, guarantees currency stability. Collective manage a common platform or basket through which we can actually, as borrowers, obtain some loans. We can even buy securities that increase in value when loans are repaid. We can allow public and private sector to borrow up to a mutually agreed amount. The repayment period depends on the amount and the borrower's profile. So an investment fund to invest in common infrastructure, expenditure, and goods. Togetherness, or oneness, unity, this is something that we have in our cultures. When spiders unite, they can tie down a lion. But we are the lion, and we cannot just behave as spiders. The rest of the world know it. Voilà pourquoi, pour nous, il est très, très important, pour ceux et celles qui sont réunis ici, qui se battent depuis déjà des décennies sur cette question de la dette, dans ce pays où on a commencé les ajustements structurels, de comprendre qu'en réalité, la mondialisation en cours veut l'Afrique sans les Africains, l'Afrique des ressources. C'est le sursaut essentiel du XXIe siècle. La question de la dette, et je n'ai pas malheureusement le temps de le démontrer, mais en réalité, lorsqu'on regarde l'architecture par laquelle les mécanismes des oligopoles fonctionnent, vous comprenez en réalité qu'au-delà du Club de Paris, il y a toutes sortes de portfolios, de mécanismes au sein même de la financiarisation qui ont été bien étudiés par des gens comme Samir Amin, comme Ben Finn, etc. Nous devons nous en abreuver, être armés de science, armés de courage et regarder véritablement les besoins essentiels de nos populations. Voilà pourquoi je crois que la stratégie commune des emprunteurs pourrait réfléchir à des démarches collectives pour emprunter collectivement, rembourser collectivement, dépenser collectivement, mais cela bien sûr dans l'esprit évidemment d'une Afrique unie et souveraine. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Professor, for your very insightful and informative remarks. I think in many ways you've set the tone for the discussion quite well. Ladies and gentlemen, as Africans, we are stuck in a creditor-centric international financial system. African countries are kept in the status quo that continues to prioritize and amplify the interests and needs of creditors over borrowers. We see this happening around us in different forms, such as the G20 Common Framework for Debt Treatment, with little to no change happening. At Development Reimagined, as most of you know, we have been pushing the concept of a borrower's club, a club where countries can come together, share knowledge and information on their lending terms with different creditors, and essentially enhance borrower agency and ultimately secure fresh financing for borrower countries. It is my hope that in this discussion, our panelists will help us to better understand where we stand today as a continent. How are we coordinating? Has that brought about any change? Why is such coordination so essential? And what innovative solutions should we be pushing for, essentially? So without further ado, to proceed to the next part of our session, I would like to invite to the stage, in this order, Ms. Martha Cortain, who is the advisor on NGOs and civil society to the President of Malawi. Dr. Dauda Sembene, who is the CEO of AfCoDD, a global development advisory based here in Dakar. Ms. Lee Everts, who is the Chief of Section for Macroeconomic Analysis in the Macroeconomic and Governance Division of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Ms. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, who is the Executive Vice President at the African Center for Economic Transformation. ACET is an African think tank focused on supporting countries to develop and implement sustainable growth strategies. Mr. Patrick Olomo, who is a policy advisor at the African Union. And last but not least, Mr. Jason Berganza, whom you all know by now is the Executive Director at AfCoDD. Before we get into the discussion, a few housekeeping rules. The session will go as follows. For the first 20 minutes, we'll hear from our excellent group of panelists on the rich topic. We will then go into 20 minutes of Q&A with the audience. Please do prepare your questions. And then we will hear final notes from each of our panelists and end the session there. May I also be kindly notified when time is running out so that we can have enough time for the Q&A session. Thank you all for joining us today. If I may just start with Martha. You hold a critical role in the office of the President of Malawi, His Excellency Lazarus Chakwera, advising the President on key developmental issues. In the past, for example, with the Paris Club, it has typically been the case that a country like Malawi cannot even be in the room when discussions of debt relief are taking place. Do you think this makes sense? And if not, what should be different?
Yes, I want to believe that it doesn't really make sense. And probably that's where the problem is. Having worked in the civil society for the most part of my life, I remember we once used to say nothing for us without us. That's a common slogan in the civil society. And so the same applies to the current discussion. Rules of natural justice demands that both sides of the party must be together. So in this context, it is not fair really that discussions about debt cancellation or restructuring take place behind closed doors, leaving out the vulnerable countries. I mean, in this case, the countries that are highly indebted, the poor countries. So it's not fair, and probably that's the question that we have to deal with right now. There's a proverb, you cannot shave somebody's hair in his absence. So that's exactly what must happen in the debt discussions. Thank you.
Those are some very good points, absolutely. Lee, if I may come to you, the UNECA is a critical institution in promoting economic and financial priorities of African countries. What has UNECA been doing to promote such coordination, and what challenges and pushbacks have you seen?
Okay, thank you so much. I have a whole book. I can talk about debt the whole day. You'll sleep and I'll start again, but I'll keep it short, all right? So maybe I won't rehash all the statistics and the numbers that's been given, but after 3 years, COVID is finished, or we think it is, but we are still, the debt situation is still deepening. With all the shocks, 2 decades of poverty has basically been erased. We need to do a lot of work to get back where we were. We have a shortfall of 200 billion a year to just achieve the SGDs. That's a lot of money. So I like the example you made, Patrick, earlier on, you know, the shortfall that can be financed with the money from illicit financial flows. Just that money plus that of the debt repayments that we're making is about 150 million. What does it mean? We have 50 million left. What does that mean for us? We are funding developing countries, guys. We need to keep that money here. We need to get our laws, our tax conventions, etc., in place. So those are some of the things that ECA work on, but I'll come back to that a little bit later. So as you know, there was a lot of work done during the COVID time and post that on helping developing countries. So there was the DSSI, which, I mean, it stopped in the midst of another drama, which is problematic. It was the share of SDRs allocated, which was skew. And it's the common framework, which is another story. So, I mean, the common framework was like this big thing that was going to help countries, and it just fell short, basically. It's like a big red herring for us. So yeah, the countries are struggling now on their own again, on a case-by-case basis to deal with their debt. And we can't continue like this. We need these clubs, even if it's 50 of them, and there's a lot of them in Africa already, but we need to support each other and reinforce that type of thing. So in my language, we would call it at this point, dis 'n gemors en 'n skande. It's a shame and it's a disaster, and we need to fix this. So we know there's no silver bullet, right? Or gold bullet or platinum bullet. But the things that ECA is working on currently is, it's a lot of advocacy work, and we've gotten real good feedback, and this is because there is a concerted, united effort. We have a high-level working group that, in that group, we have the IMF, the World Bank, which we are giving our recommendations to. In that group is all the African ministers, or most of them, the African Development Bank, the AU, and the African Import and Export Bank. And that is some of your big stakeholders that you want around the table to talk about these things. So we are advocating for providing, obviously, debt relief, properly operationalizing the G20 common framework, extending the DSSI, injecting new SDRs, and revising that quota system that's really not working for us, and trying to go back to the original way of how we see SDRs and allocating them in a 5-yearly manner. And, you know, there's many others. Also, we have another cooperative system exists is the Sustainable Debt Coalition, and it aims to increase available financing for green development effort, because now we're talking about sustainable financing. And I can get into that quite a lot. I can talk the whole day, but again, I'll keep it very short. And then on a more technical, so we don't just talk, there's a technical side as well. We do support countries on things like domestic arrears strategies, medium-term debt strategies, drafting those, coming up with new plans, macroeconomic modeling of debt, development of capital markets, which, I mean, this was brought up, all these things were brought up earlier. And all of this is done through peer learning. Countries are learning from each other. African countries are learning from each other. And I think for me, that's where a borrowers club, you know, it talks to us, because we learn from each other. And it's obviously very important for accessing low interest loans at this point, because what we need in the short term now is cheap debt. That's what we need. And we cannot be ashamed to take out debt. Developed countries loan every day. Even they don't have the domestic resources for their own development. So, you know, there is nothing wrong with it, and we need it. So on the issues of pushback, I mean, in terms of African countries, I think we all know what the issues are, and it's been mentioned by you, ma'am. We cannot be outside of the boardroom when we're discussing these things. We have to be in there, and we have to come up with our own solutions. Other things are things like including the private sector in these discussions, and they've become problematic because basically these guys want a free ride. And these are some of the issues that we have to deal with. And I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritties of it. The next issue is also the issues of credit ratings, which has been raised before, I think, by you, Dauda. And we need a real regulatory framework for credit rating agencies and more transparency, because these things are not done in a uniform manner, and Africa is always the one that gets hurt in the process. And then, of course, I think earlier Patrick mentioned this, we need the G20 to include the AU. We have to have a voice in discussions and policies that are made that affect us. And lastly, but not least, you know, this power imbalance in the world has become a big problem, and if we stand together, it can actually just help us achieve our goals. So thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Absolutely. I think especially your point on credit rating agencies is often overlooked. So it's really great that you mentioned that. Dauda, if I may come to you next. You used to have a very important role at the IMF where you've had to coordinate African views. We've seen efforts by the IMF recently to bring more borrowers into the room with, for instance, the Sovereign Debt Roundtable. Do you think this has helped at all, and particularly in terms of elevating the African voice on debt issues?
Well, thank you very much, Etsy. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, you're right. I think I was very much privileged to have been the representative of 23 African countries on the IMF Executive Board. I think it was actually a very central position where we could see how those countries deal with debt challenges. And you're right, I think the IMF, which I know very well, has been playing a critical role in the launch of the Global Sovereign debt roundtable. The IMF is co-chairing that roundtable with the World Bank and also the Indian Minister of Finance, which is assuming the G20 presidency. So that roundtable has been critical, and I think the task when it was launched back in February was that the objective was to make sure that it provided platforms between creditors and debtors to discuss about debt restructuring and how actually to tackle the issues that are, or the shortcomings of the common debt framework. As you know, there was 4 African countries that apply for treatment under the common debt framework, including Zambia, Chad, Ethiopia, and Ghana. So at that roundtable, the 3 countries were invited. It was Ghana and Zambia and Ethiopia to be the representative of debtors countries. And of course, facing them were some bilateral creditors, including China, France, which was representing Paris Club and others. So all of that just to say that the key purpose of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable was to help find solutions to the common debt, the implementation of the common debt framework. It's critical, it's important, it's very helpful. But I think to respond to your questions, I'm not so sure it really helped bring on board all borrowing countries. Why? Because first of all, you're talking about a very narrow issue about debt issues, so which is the debt restructuring. It is critical, of course, especially for countries that are trying to get some debt treatment and to recover debt sustainability. It is important, but like I said, you have around that round table only 3 African countries that were represented. Are they able to sort of convey the voice of Africa? I don't think so. I think if you really want to make sure that Africa has a voice or its voice is appropriately conveyed, you have to find a way to have either the African Union or have at least a Pan-African or regional body that would be actually able to speak on behalf of the whole continent. And I think that's where I am agreeing with Lee. I think it is critical that the G20 grants a seat to Africa so we can have a representative that can speak for Africa on global economic issues, particularly debt issues. So we were quite reassured last week when Indian Prime Minister Prime Modi suggested that he would be proposing that Africa get its seat at the upcoming G20 summit, which will take place in India this month. So I think that would be a critical opportunity for Africa to really be able to really make its voice heard when it comes to global debt issues. But I think actually that's not a panacea, being a member of the G20. I think some of you may have seen some piece that myself and former Prime Minister Ibrahim Mayaki actually wrote about how important it was for Africa to get ready for a G20 membership by putting in place a strategy for really leveraging that seat. Because I think having it all and not making a good use of it would not be helpful for Africa. Having it and not being prepared to convey the right message would not help us actually make our voice heard on global debt issues. So I think it's critical to use those type of opportunities for Africa to really convey the messages that it does. So that's my long answer to your question. It is important that roundtable is critical. Actually, we have seen that it has already been having some impact because it actually it mandated the IMF and the World Bank to come up with some very clear processes on how they would be sharing information in the process, let's say, of putting in place debt sustainability analysis, in the process also of facilitating debt restructuring discussion. So it is helpful, but I think actually apart from those 3 African countries that were there, maybe there was scope for making sure that other African countries actually were represented. One last thing before I conclude is, when we talk about debt restructuring, it is important. We are talking about countries that are already really falling under the burden of debt and which needs critical and urgent support to be able to get back to their feet. But those are not the whole Africa. We have many African countries that are not yet under debt distress and that needs to be supported. And those countries are those that have maybe low or moderate risk of debt distress. Those countries need to be supported to have access to low-cost finance. And I think that's what also my colleagues were talking about, Lee. And how would you do that? There are many ways. Of course, we can come back to that after. But I think the issue about the credit rating agency that Lee talks about was critical. Or you have to make sure that they do their job, which is actually very much welcome because it is critical for attracting capital to Africa. But they have to do it in a transparent manner and using transparent methodologies, but also being accountable to actually both the borrowers and creditors. I think this is critical. So just to say that Africa is not just made of countries with high risk or high risk of debt distress and countries in debt distress. There are other countries that are not there yet, but that needs urgently some support in terms of liquidity support, but in terms of course, having other entities like the credit rating agency being able to convey faithfully the risk, the level of risk that investors would be facing if they decide to invest in those countries. So I look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dauda, and definitely some very interesting points there. I think with initiatives like the Sovereign Debt Roundtable, it's very easy to be sidetracked, just including a few borrowers there, and I think that's why the establishment of a borrowers club is ever more important, right? But thank you so much for that. Patrick, if I may come to you next. So AU member states obviously coordinate on many issues every year. To what degree have you seen discussions touch on debt issues and in what form specifically? And do you think that there's more scope, especially if the AU joins the G20?
Thank you very much. And I think I would like, first of all, to say something important, because there is need for us to effectively know what is the role of the AU in this global discussion on debt. One of the critical things that we need to be aware of, for some of us in this room, we were not even there when the AU and AUC were already, involved in these debt discussions. In the 1960s, 70s, they were already talking about it. And if you look at, the data and, the archives of the AU, you will see that this has always been at the center of the discussions that the AU or AUC was having with all the partners around the world. So the question is, why are we talking about the same thing continuously? If in 1960s you were talking about debt, 70s you did the same, 80s you did the same, 90s, 2000s, till now, it means there is a problem somewhere. And Jason, maybe you remember that we had a session on this in Nairobi just a month ago, and with African finance ministers, I was moderating the session, and as provocative as I am, and you know that I like problems, I told them that just give me one reason for you to be seated in the panel here, and we are talking about this, repeatedly. You are tasking the AU to go and negotiate, for debt issues, and also to advocate for a seat at the G20. But are you sure that you have exhausted the problems internally here, and that now you are facing the world to express yourself? Because let me tell you that you can bring all the mechanism you want in terms of debt, a borrower club, a crying club, if you want, even a begging club. You can imagine all the solutions. But unfortunately, if you are not addressing the root cause of your problems, one, you will not be able to solve the problem. Two, nobody will listen to you. Let me take an example. And the G20, they said we are... We are We're not begging. We are advocating. Advocating for a seat. But let me tell you something. We need to be invited to the table. And I told you, the potential that we have is an undeniable potential. Undeniable. The statistics that we have today, as I said earlier, you have 18% of the population today, which is supposed to be 25% or something of the global population. Now, if we look in terms of trillions of dollars, what the GDP of the AU will be, we started from a GDP of 1 trillion, in the 2000s. Now we are 4.3 trillion US dollars. And it is projected to be not less than 15 to 25 trillions US dollars in just 2 decades. This is if we are able to address our structural issues. So the key question is, what shall we do to make sure that when we sit at the table, that we are respectable, speakers? One is to make sure that you are able to feed your people, as I said, and that you are able to achieve the total economic transformation of the continent. Because if you read the archives of the AU, they were not talking about economic transformation. They were saying total economic transformation of the continent. And I speak here because my sister from AfCoDD, which is Africa Center for Economic Transformation, will speak. If we fail transforming, there is nothing that we will be able to do. But let me tell you a story about Africans. We like perfection. True. I spoke about the African financial institutions. It applies to all our institutions that are in the Abuja Treaty. What we want is to have perfect, institutions when we create them. But nothing is perfect at the beginning. There is nothing that has never been perfect at the beginning. It should be weak, and then we work on weaknesses to make sure that we are able to achieve, excellence that we are looking for. Why do I say this? I say this because when you listen to the discussions of Africans, you want to set up a debt monitoring mechanism. When you propose, the documents to member states who are our owners, they will tell you, no, you have to make sure that this speaks to this, that this is perfect, da, 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 da. But at the end of the day, they will tell you, no, you are not ready, don't do it. We have to make sure that our imperfections, are the foundations of the future excellence and perfection. If we fail doing that, there is nothing we will do. Look at this TV here. Do you see this TV screen? Imagine in the 1980s when we were young boys. You were not there. There were big TVs like this with long heads like mine, like this. Imagine Japanese if they have said, let's wait for the time when we will be able to do smart TVs to start manufacturing TVs. They wouldn't have been here, with these beautiful screens and TVs, because as you see, that is innovation, and it is a process. Development also is a process. You start from imperfections, and then you end up to excellence and perfection. This is what we need to do. So when we go to the G20, I was just joking when I said, are we begging? No, we are not. When we go there, our message is that we do not want to come and beg for food. That when we are on the table, we will say, can you allow wheat to come to Africa? Because our people will die from hunger. But we will go there to say, starting from 2025, Africa will be a totally financial, stable, and dynamic continent. because we will set up the African Monetary Institute, we will set up the central bank 3 years after, we will set up the African Monetary Fund, we will set up the African Investment Bank. I heard about investment in the room, because as of today, our level of investment is 20% of GDP, but if we want to totally transform, it should be at least 40% of the GDP. Where are you getting the money? Nobody will borrow it to you. Don't forget, they never borrow money to a weak person, and they will borrow it to you at very, very strange conditions to make sure that you are not able to achieve anything. So, if you want to build independence, make sure that when you speak to your partners, that you speak with a convincing voice, with a stronger voice. And let me tell you a little story. My sister is here, she can tell you. We have discussions with some of our partners in terms of resource mobilization and resource allocation, and you know it. You know, somebody will tell you, yes, I'm giving you money, I want you to do this and that. We said no. We said no. Why did we say no? We said no because money should not come at the terms of somebody you don't know the intentions. You should be able to accept money when you are sure that it is serving your sole purposes. But for us, Africans, because we like money, in fact, we steal our money, we send it somewhere, and we go and beg for little money. And at the end of the day, when we are treated badly, we start crying everywhere. I said before that there is need for us to remobilize, to make sure that starting from today and to achieve total economic transformation, that we are able to make sure that when we borrow money, we use it for total economic transformation of the continent. And when we have that seat at the G20, we should let people know that we are the force of tomorrow, because we have the population, we have the land, we have the resources, the strategic resources that we all alluded to here today, strategic resources, and we have all the means that are going to lead the transformation of the world tomorrow. So time has come for us to make sure that we are able to achieve our prosperity. And prosperity lies on your hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Some very interesting points there. First, I think is, create that institution, however imperfect it may be, and focus on making it stronger. And I think also your point on know who you're borrowing money from is also extremely important that we need to recognize. Mavis, if I might come to you next. When African countries coordinate their positions on key financial issues, very often some creditors are in the room. Do you think those creditors should be in the room? What are the pros and cons of including creditors?
Thank you very much, Esther, for inviting me and Asset to be part of this conversation. Let me just take a minute to endorse what my brother Patrick said, which is that however we have the conversation, however we get into the green room or sit at the table, we must go there with agency. And it really matters. And that agency begins when we are truly transformed. Our economies are diversified so that we are not at the risk of the boom-bust cycle that we currently have. We are, export competitive as a continent. We are productive. We are using technology effectively. But most important, it's benefiting our people. And so we really do need to deepen our growth, and that's the only way we can transform. But coming to your question quickly, I think for me the question was who he pays the piper calls the tune. Money talks. So you are asking, should they be in the room? If they are paying for the analysis, if they are paying for the facilities, if they are paying for everything, yes, they should be in the room. But is it right? Not necessarily. And so what I'd like to do is let's look at the times when we have had a green room on our own. Look, at the end of the day, we've kind of like created a situation where debt looks like a bad thing. Debt is not bad. If you use debt effectively, it's actually good. Everybody uses debt. It becomes a problem when it's the vicious cycle that we're in that Patrick is talking about, okay? So, if we are going to negotiate, yes, let's go to the table with creditors or friends of creditors. But alongside that, let's have our own green room, okay, where we are negotiating our positions, we are making our decisions. And right now, given the complexity of our creditor mix, we can't afford to go in blindly at all, because we're sitting in a continent right now where not only do we owe money to the international community, a lot of our middle classes are being crippled because they bought bonds, and we are defaulting in some countries. So our creditor mix is complex, and we need robust solutions. So we need our own green room. And it's not like we haven't done it before, okay? We went to the table for HIPIC, and we came out thinking, actually, HIPIC isn't that good. So we went into our own green room under the auspices of UNECA and some pretty powerful presidents and ministers of finance. And we said, actually, we want an enhanced HIPIC. We went back into the room with our partners, and we got enhanced HIPIC. It was the kind of package that we needed. So that is what we need to do. And, you know, every time we've had a crisis and we've put our heads together, we work our way through it. COVID, we were left alone. We felt a bit abandoned. We got our heads together. HIV/AIDS, we were really concerned. We pushed an agenda. It changed. The challenge we have today is that we are struggling to see where the coordination comes from. So for us, and you know, for all of us who believe in the Borrowers Club concept, today we do need a Borrowers Club. It's complex. We need something. We need to do the analysis to convince our leaders of the value of a Borrowers Club. Secondly, and I call out to our Policy Institute brothers, UNECA, civil society, let's stop fighting. Let's be honest. We all sit in here and we blame our leaders. We are no better, you know, because somebody else is paying for us. So we are all doing our own different analysis and going all in different directions. Let's come together and let's do the work together to support our leaders to push the Borrowers Club agenda. And once we do that, the third thing is, parliamentarians in the room. If we want it to be an African solution, we need to pay for it. Seriously? Let's stop this thing about donors always coming in to pay for things. You need to write the checks for the analysis to be done, and you need to hear the home truths, whether you like it or not, within our complex political economy. Then we have a truly African-led, African-owned analysis informing the Borrowers Club. Then we call on our friends in the creditors' nations, and we say, friends, we have a proposal. Help us convince your partners, your leaders in those countries to take this agenda forward. And I believe that way we will find a sensible solution to where we are today.
Thank you, Mavis. I think your point on us coordinating first and then bringing in the creditor is absolutely essential. The green room, as you said. Jason, if I may go to you next. What specific issues and topics do you think would be useful for borrowers to coordinate on, and what can we really learn from each other?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on this session. And without running the risk of repeating what a lot has been said, I think first of all, it's to avoid being distracted by processes that continue to be dominated by certain power centers that continue to then undermine the democratic governance of how the global financial architecture operates. And by this I mean, although there seems to be some consensus here around the invitation or advocacy or begging to be part of the G20 for the AUC or the African Union, I think it's important to understand the political dimensions of what that means in negotiations, in terms of coordination, and in terms of enhancing the democratic governance of a world order that, or world disorder, as Barbara had mentioned this morning, actually means. Civil society organizations for many years have been advocating for many of these architectural reforms to be taking place under the auspices of the United Nations. Now, despite its inherent weaknesses, it still remains a space where member states, particularly from the global south, tend to have an equal voice or a voice that matters in decision making. So when it comes to things like coordinating or the idea of a borrowers club and what role that might then have when we have a G20 process that is largely undermining this idea, one can only get worried that there is going to be a situation where African governments are being split across so many different processes and then having to trade off different things across different processes. And I'll illustrate this with an example. The Mbeki panel report, which was very foundational in putting illicit financial flows on the map with regard to not just the quantum in US dollars, but actually the definition that went beyond the illegal forms or illegal dimensions of illicit financial flows to taking in very harmful and disruptive corporate practices, is now part and parcel of a UN definition, where other groupings or other processes have been hell-bent on trying to deny or remove that from the definitions. Why am I using this as an example? It is potentially a trading horse, to try and weaken a process that is largely democratic to one that is potentially not democratic if you go down the route there. So if you want to bargain within the G20 or negotiate within the G20 for something, there might be something you have to give up either in the Borrowers Club or at the United Nations. And so as civil society organizations, we need to keep that in mind and be very cognizant that even though the language appears to be accommodating or appears to be inclusive, there are trading horses that are going to have to happen in the future. And we want to ensure that this is not the case, particularly for an initiative as progressive as the Borrowers Club. Another instance is, what are the technical issues and the political issues that need to be underscored during these coordinated and coherent messages from the continent. We have managed on many occasions as a continent and as our leaders, when we go for the so-called summits, the Africa this summit or the Africa that summit, our leaders are very, very happy to coordinate in a coherent way to go with cap in hand. And I think, Patrick, you've mentioned this many a time. I think where there is an important need for an initiative like the Borrowers Club is to illustrate the political sovereignty and the political autonomy that comes with actually going into these spaces, including the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable initiative, going into these processes with the idea that we are a sovereign continent, we are autonomous, and we have the ability to make our own decisions. And I think this is very important, again, for civil society, and this is why we have been very critical of the Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, because there is this inherent assumption that the decision can be almost brought to conclusion, and then there's this tokenistic inclusion of governments, of the countries, of some civil society, and then creditors and international financial institutions, rubber stamp decisions that have already been made. So I do think it's very important, as the keynote speaker for this session has said, that in everything that we're doing, there needs to be at the center of it the idea that the continent needs to buttress its political autonomy, its political sovereignty when going into these things. And lest we forget that there's always going to be horse trading in all these different processes. And as civil society, our job is to ensure that all our partners, all our stakeholders are aware of these tactics in spreading the negotiation table very thin, in the full knowledge, as Patrick and many others have said, we may not have the political and technical capacity to spread ourselves across all these different spaces. And the people who are inviting us or advocating for us are aware of this. They know that, at some point, there may not be an AUC delegation. So what will they do? They will second somebody, or they may recruit someone who will work on their behalf of the AUC and then go to these meetings and represent what they call the AUC. So I think this is important. These are strategies that we must be aware of in terms of horse trading and negotiations that will potentially further undermine the ideas of trying to promote democratic governance in the global space under the auspices of the United Nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. I think your points on sovereignty and making sure that it's Africans who make the decisions is very important. And I think the trade-off can sometimes be quite tricky, especially in ensuring that our coordination is actually effective. Martha, if I may come to you, what lessons on borrowing would you like to discuss with other countries, if any? And how do you get over the sensitivities of doing so? As you know, some countries and institutions, for instance, might feel that they cannot share information about debt contracts with others. So do you think that that is a barrier in any way?
Yeah, the biggest lesson is borrowing to invest and not for consumption, really. That should be the bottom line, even as an individual. You do not want to borrow to consume, but to invest. And our belief as government is that as long as it is public debt, then the general public must be aware. They must also be part of the discussion as well as the solution. In our constitution, there is a provision for access to information, but there was also a law that was specifically passed, which we call the access to information, to ensure that there are strategic actions in place that will enable stakeholders access the information that they are actually looking for. I would also like to add that our president has been publicly discussing about making reference to the current public debts, its consequences, and then the steps that government is taking to address the debt crisis that we are in, either making steps towards restructuring or total debt cancellation. Recently, when he attended the BRICS meeting, the summit in South Africa, he took a deliberate effort to meet the leadership from India and China, who happens to hold a big chunk of the current debt that we are grappling with. All this is with an intention of coming up with arrangements that could be friendly in terms of debt servicing. Most of the debts were incurred between 2012 and 2020, but I think significant debt repayment started somewhere around 2020. You might also wish to know that from the faith perspective, somewhere it is written that the borrower is a slave to the lender. So the lender would deliberately put in, some mechanisms just to make sure that you are put at a corner and you really can't come out of the debt. So sometimes governments have been forced to borrow because maybe the loan looks cheap, the interest is not really that much, but then over time when you put so many loans together, it no longer becomes cheap. So it actually becomes expensive on the part of the citizens. So the intention is to make sure that government is accountable to the citizens by providing regular updates. So that is from the actual implementation of the action of the Access to Information Bill. You might also be aware that the executive arm of government would also have agencies like the central bank, which is the regulator that is also responsible for the management of these kinds of contracts. So even the central bank has gone a step ahead to provide press releases on a regular basis in terms of the status of the public debt, what is it, how are we servicing it, and what are the implications. If you follow news, you might have noted that we've been having the challenges of fuel, largely due to forex shortage. And the forex shortage is coming from the debt servicing. So somewhere, somehow, the citizen has to suffer because we also want to meet this obligation of debt repayment. So at the end of the day, I mean, you can't have everything. So the pain is actually being shared with the citizens. But then the central bank has been making these releases just to ensure that everybody is on the same page. We know what is happening. We know why we have this problem, and that what is it that we're trying to achieve at the end of it all. As a government, we also recently launched the National Action Plan on Open Government. This actually includes a plan on open parliament. We are mindful of the specific role that parliamentarians have. Yes, they are lawmakers, but we are also mindful that the laws come from the executive arm of government. And the members of parliament have a role to scrutinize and provide the checks and balances. So the intention is to ensure that the debt contraction process that is done in the National Assembly is transparent and open to the general public, but also colleagues in the civil society that help with checks and balances. They can follow through and probably also ask the tough questions that must be asked to the members of parliament. Do we want to get loans because they are there? I mean, from an individual point of view, sometimes you get involved in impulse buying. You just want to buy it not because you need it, but because it's there, probably it's cheap. So we also want to encourage the members of parliament to say, do they want just to contract a loan because it is there? Do we need that loan as a country? Do the members of parliament have the ability to say, yes, government, we appreciate you brought this, but we think it's not necessary. All this in the best interest of the citizens. So there's actually more that's being done to make sure that there is information in the public. And then we also believe that as we make information available, people are able to debate. Government can get homegrown solutions and ideas on how best we can come out of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. I think in many ways, your point on sometimes just taking loans just because they're available, I think is very important. I think we need to ask ourselves, with that loan, are we able to, invest it in growth-producing assets, infrastructure, and in different sectors that will be able to give us that return for the necessary growth and economic transformation is very important. I know we're running a bit low on time, so I'll just ask one final question. Maybe this will be for you. So recently, ASSET, along with the Finance for Development Lab, announced a list of demands from African finance ministers on the reform of the global financial architecture. Can you share some insights on how that coordination came about and some of the positives and negatives from that?
Thank you very much, Esther. So it started with a discussion around the lack of an African voice in the global financial architecture. There was just this constant narrative that we were hearing at the table. But we also knew as an organization that a lot of research was happening on the African continent, from African think tanks, global think tanks, UNECA, etc. So what we decided to do was to bring all the stakeholders together from the research side and to put together a simple one-page of key messages. So we all sat down, we looked at the various research, the different conversations that we'd all been having with the different finance ministers, and we came up with what was in effect a crib sheet of 5 key points. It's now 6, but 5 key points. And then we hosted a dinner in the margins of the spring meetings. And we got 6 ministers to review it, and they fully endorsed it. So the partners were there with the ministers. We had the conversation. They loved the crib sheet. It was easy for them. They also liked the fact that the crib sheet was underpinned by rigorous research. So what we found was that during the spring meetings, those ministers started sticking to the script. And we ourselves, as organizations, were sticking to the script. So at the end of the spring meeting, there was a bit of excitement about, African ministers might have a common vision. And then we went to Paris, and we saw that continuity happening. In terms of what worked well, it was a handful of research institutions, UNECA, etc., that came, AfCoDD, I forgot my brother here, who came together to put together this statement. At the dinner, the ministers asked us to put it together towards a declaration in Marrakesh as part of a large advocacy campaign on Africa's voice for the GFA. What worked well was a handful of us came together. We got a handful of ministers who've signed up to it. What didn't work well or hasn't worked well is there is a lot of noise, and we are not building on each other's work. So the coordination remains weak, more on our side than on the government side. So as policy institutes, as researchers, as civil society, we are all pushing different declaration. They're all saying the same thing by 1 or 2 lines. And if we don't come together to align, we will get to Marrakesh, and rightfully, our leaders will be confused again. Because today I go in with a declaration, tomorrow you go in with a declaration, you go in with a declaration, and our leaders are like, okay, so which script am I using today? We need to find a way of getting to Marrakesh with a single declaration. That's the only way in which we will reinforce messages, and we will ensure that presidents and finance ministers are actually speaking to the same hymn sheet. And when that happens, and focusing on a few priorities, the rest of the world will have no choice but to listen to us. It stops being a mantra, and it becomes almost like a common speech that you can't walk away from. So my ask between now and Marrakesh is really an ask for us in this room. And that ask is, let's come together towards one declaration. We can reinforce what each other have said in that declaration. It doesn't have to be, an asset flag or a UNECA flag or an AfCoDD flag driving this agenda. And I'm pretty sure, I know my colleague Gates is in the room, they will be very happy to see that we all came together with support from them to work with our ministers around this declaration. And let's come out of Marrakesh with 6 key points that we can hold the world to account on behalf of Africa and push the agenda forward. And I think, as Jason said earlier on, when we are pushing that agenda, we also know what the trade-offs are. But at the forefront of all of those trade-offs is the voice of Africa, and most importantly, the ordinary African citizen out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mavis. I think that puts a lot of responsibility on us as well to provide that necessary support to our governments. I think is very important. We are running a bit out of time, so we will be moving to the question and answer session. Can we have someone to be moving the mic? If you could kindly state your name, the institution you're representing, and your question. There's someone at the very back, I believe in red. Yeah. Oh, the one, yes, that. And if you could indicate to which panelist your question is directed to.
Thank you so much. I think it is to anybody there. They are all able-bodied to can answer it. In the spirit of reimagining, rethinking, reorganizing, and remobilizing.
Sorry, miss, can you please stand up as we can't see you?
Oh, you can hear me though? In the spirit of reimagining, rethinking, reorganizing, and remobilizing for an African world order, what should the AU be doing? My prognosis is that the United Nations itself is micromanaged because whoever funds it owns it, isn't it? It was alluded to, money talks and bullshit walks. Now, if the UN itself suffers that, how much more for the AU? So what should we be doing in the AU to achieve all of those slogans, Jason? My second question is a quick one also. African Free Trade Agreement. Are we ever gonna achieve that? What are we gonna be trading in, guys? Toilet paper, some of those machines, we don't even make them here that make toilet paper. So shouldn't we be investing in heavy industry? And I'm asking this question as a former Navy Admiral. The biggest ship in the South African Navy, which is a support ship at sea, that's a very heavy task to perform. It's built in Durban by a white government. The black government took over and decided to buy ships in Germany. When we asked, why are you shutting down a shipbuilding industry? We were told, African countries won't buy from us because it's debt money, it's borrowed money, it's this money. Their masters won't allow them to buy from another African country, heavy industry. So how are we going to get out of this quagmire? Because unless and until we invest in heavy industry and we can develop these minerals ourselves, they will keep flying and we shall keep borrowing. Thank you.
Thank you. I think let's take one more question and then we'll move to the panelists. We'll take three, okay. The individual in the back.
Here?
Can we start with you?
Okay.
And then we'll go to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think I'd like to just add my voice to thank the panelists and the key speaker of that session. Mine is very simple. I wanted to, especially looking at the concerns that you raised in terms of speaking with one voice, making decisions as Africa. I wanted to find out, what are your thoughts in terms of regional blocks and regional integration? Because we have been talking about having one voice as Africa in decision making. But then we are not talking about the consolidation of the regional blocks. And mark you, Africa is not short of treaties, protocols, what do you call them, policies, all that there. But then for how long? And then number two, what about decision making and the political class? Because it is about political goodwill. So for as long as we talk and the people who are making decisions, non-inclusive, non-participatory, rule of law that doesn't work, non-respect of the rule of law, no accountability, no transparency, systems and structures that don't work. That's where our problem begins. And I just wanted to hear your voice on that, but especially in looking at the 5 regional blocks that we have in Africa, do they speak in one voice? Looking at the 4 pillars of integration, the customs union, common market protocol, single customs territory, and political federation. For how long? Thank you.
Thank you. I think we can take 2 more questions. Let's start with the individual in the front in the white shirt.
Thank you very much. My name is Leo Atapu. I work with AnIJ in Nigeria. I come from a community in Nigeria, or a state, where if you are usually advised that if you don't go and borrow money from certain persons. If you borrow money there, they will make some juju that you will not be able to pay back. And you remain the slave of that lender. And he will continue to trouble you until you finish all your assets in repayment. That's the situation that Africa has found itself in the hands of some of its lenders. And the question remains, how long will Africa be turning around, cap in hand? You talk about lending, borrowing. I listened to some of the government officials that spoke earlier today, and they talk about how they have very well utilized the loans they have acquired here in Senegal. And it beats my imagination to see that African political elites continue to borrow money, even to pay salaries in my country, to pay salary of public workers, yeah? To even finance health and education. And then you ask, how do you repay that kind of facility? And then the interest continue to build, and you continue to turn around that circle. So the question is, where is the political will, as my sister earlier alluded to? Where's the political will from our leaders? Muammar Gaddafi made all the effort to establish the African Union. He was taken out. Yeah? And Africa, we are still looking. So I'm more interested in the mobilization, in the 4 R's. We need to mobilize as Africans. The current political leaders cannot take us there. We must move. We must mobilize. We must begin to dethrone some of the leaders we are finding here. My president believed that Chad is the problem of Nigeria. And then he wants to mobilize ECOWAS to go and invade Chad and Niger. I don't think that is the problem of Nigeria. So it is important that we begin to think of how to enthrone the right set of leadership that can take Africa to where Patrick has been describing all since morning. We need civil society organization that can also drive that process, that will hold our leaders accountable, not the ones that will continue to move from one meeting to the other. I imagine 50 years we are talking about Central Bank of Africa, and we are unable to realize it. Why? The political will is not there for the current leadership. So how do we enthrone the right set of leadership? Question to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take one final question. The individual in the back that's been putting his hand up for quite a while now. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. For quite a while, you said the word. I wish to thank the panelists for all what they said. And when I take this and put on what I heard since this morning, I'm having a comment here. and a worry also. I heard about us looking for a seat at the G20. I'm really worried. When we want to have a seat there, what if we don't get that seat? I'm not asking this for technical reasons. I'm just asking this because we need to factor in why is it that the G20 even exists in a world where we have the UN. The reason why the G20 exists is a strategic reason that we should factor in when we look for space there. And that's where I want to come and join my two brothers, Jason and Patrick, on what they said. What we need is to be tactful on how we coordinate our reflection and action to change the current architecture. The current architecture is not something that we will change just because we go out there and start crying. We need to fix things at home. Starting from what Leo just said, we need good leaders, but we also need ourselves to have good actions in such a way that when we've done all the good actions that we need internally, we can show the strength that we really have, because Africa, we do have the strength. We do even have the money that we look for outside, because we have resources which we can turn into money. Same as debt is not bad as such. Financialization of natural resources could not be bad too if we do it the right way. And if we do it the right way, I think we will then find the resources that we are looking for outside. So we need to factor in the interests of those who control the international financial architecture today. Because the international financial architecture that we want to transform or reform today is controlled by people who are not going to let us just do it. So I agree with Patrick that we need to fix our things here, and when we finish fixing our things, we'll not even need to ask for a seat. People will come and invite us to come and sit with them, to discuss with them, because we are the ones who have what all the world needs. We are not the ones in trouble. They are in trouble, but they make us believe that we are the ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we can start with Patrick, because the first question was all about the AU, and then anyone else in the panel can answer any of the other questions.
Thank you very much. And I think the set of questions that we just had now are extremely important, as they are certainly putting at the center of the discussion, the key issues that we are really aimed at addressing if we need to move forward. What is the role of the AU? Because this is the question that came from the first, intervention. Let me tell you what is the AU. The AU, how I see it and how you should see it. First of all, the AU is the sole voice of Africa when it speaks to economic transformation and development. I said the sole voice, because we have that mandate and we have that power to be the voice of Africa when it speaks to continental issues. That's one. Secondly, the AU has an extraordinary convincing power, a convening power of convening, African leaders and African, citizens to speak about the issues that are relevant for the continent. Thirdly, the AU also operates, as, a research center where all the policies that are aimed to achieve Africa's development are formulated. And fourthly, the AU is your institution, and it is at your service to make sure that we are able to achieve whatever we would like to achieve. Let me just first speak about the convening power. My sister here alluded to the very good efforts that they are doing in terms of framing an African position on the negotiation on the global financial architecture. But let me tell you that this is also an area where we see fragmentations, and when we see people speaking 10,000 voices, and at the end of the day, when you look, they are speaking the same issues. Why do I say that? Under the auspices of the African Union and the UNECA, we have what we call the high-level working group on the global financial architecture. That is a body, a continental body, an institutional body that assemble African ministers of finance to speak one voice. Let me give you just an example. We had the STC, which is the Specialized Technical Committee on Finance, Monetary Affairs, Economic Planning and Integration last month in Nairobi. When you look at the numbers of ministers that attend the meeting, luckily we had 13 this year, 13 ministers. When you go at the negotiations at the World Bank, you see 55 African ministers sitting in a small room like kids. You understand? Sometimes our ministers are standing in meetings. You were there. You can just cry. Why? This is where we need to speak our issues before even heading there. We have to speak here. So let's make sure that, when we speak to our ministers, we alert them on the need to participate in our meetings. Because when we speak here, we have a common position, then we can defend it. And also, for all the civil society organizations that are present here, Jason, you are my witness here, and also others that are in the room. Under the leadership of His Excellency Muchanga, I think we have seen a paradigm shift these recent years. Because NGOs, African NGOs, are now invited to participate in the discussions of the STC. You were in Nairobi, and you were before in Addis for other meetings. So you are all invited to be part of those meetings to make sure that when we speak there, we are able to speak one united voice. You are invited, and I would like to see you next year when we organize the STC to make sure that this discussion be, taken on board and in consideration to move forward. Just to respond to you, for Marrakesh, we may consider organizing a quick meeting, before Marrakesh, and under the auspices of the AU, UNECA, and yourselves to make sure that that common African position is framed, circulated to ministers, and then we can defend it with the strength that is needed. So that is what we can offer. Now, speaking about the AfCFTA, as I said before, you have a market of 1.3 billion people, but unfortunately, you are not even able to produce, even the little goods that are just essential for basic consumption. Let's just talk about food. Imagine the magnitude of the food market in Africa if you are to feed 1.3 billion people. This is where we need to invest first. And then we can invest in heavy industries, because there is a strategic vision that we need to embrace, because you have to develop the right skills, you have to harness the technology and to produce it, as my sister said rightfully back there, that we don't even have the technology to make sure that we are able to produce. So how do we go about it? Science, technology, innovation. Let's give ourselves 5 years to say we have a 5-year investment plan in science, technology, and innovation to make sure that we are able to embrace, the production cycle that we need under the AfCFTA. Now, in terms of coordination at regional economic community levels, and I'm very happy because she was able to eloquently present the steps of the Abuja Treaty that are, paving the way to the African Economic Community. But as I said earlier, our main problem, and it was reinforced by the last speaker, is leadership. With a dedicated leadership, with a visionary leadership, with a committed leadership, we will be able to achieve results. But with leaders that are just, looking at personal interest, we will not be able to achieve economic transformation or production or whatever you want to achieve. We will not be able. So leadership is important. And within the continent, you can see that there is now, that leadership it is emerging, because if you look at some countries, you can see that there are committed leaders, there are visionary leaders that are worldwide respected today. It is true that it is a process, as I said, and that we are gradually moving there to make sure that Africa becomes, the big economic power that we are envisaging. Because what we're looking forward is to make sure that Africa becomes the growth pole of the next century, starting from now. So coordination is important, and we are working with regional economic communities wherever we go. If you look at the AU processes, you will see that in July, in Nairobi also, we had what we call the AU coordination mechanism, which is the summit of the AU with regional economic communities, and all the regional economic communities were there to make sure that they are able to speak the same voice in global discussions, continental and global discussions. Now, how long will we talk about, the issue of borrowing and lending in Africa? The first thing is to make sure that we have that economic transformation that we are talking about. It is fundamental, because without us being able to produce the goods that we are consuming, we will always be subject to borrowing. And we will borrow, and as you said, my brother, it is an extremely vicious cycle in which we are today. It is like a storm of perfect, connected, issues that are hampering our development. Because the people that are out there, they are also thinking strategic as we are trying to do now. Strategy is about you looking at your future and deciding of the steps that you are going to take to move gradually to a process of development. But unfortunately, when we have a plan like Agenda 2063, who follows Agenda 2063 when we look at, the assessment of that development plan? You will see that few countries are able to exhibit positive results. So it is our responsibility to make sure that we are able to move forward in the right direction when we are looking at this. Yes, remobilizing, it is a key word here, because we have already started the process. Now it is time for us to gather again and to make sure that we are able to achieve, our continental issues. But this starts with a conversation at home. You cannot fix the global financial architecture. You cannot be a prominent speaker at the G20 if you are unable to have your house in order. As we saw this morning, and I'm saying this today, I am from the AU, but if you take time to listen to the polls of African citizens and African economies, if we fail taking the right decisions from now on, that little epidemic that we see spreading in West Africa, that has now transmitted to Central Africa, will certainly continue to spread, because you cannot silence people from being frustrated of not being able to access economic facilities, for not being able to enlarge their opportunity, their economic opportunities. So time has come for us to make sure that we are able to implement Because if we set up the financial institutions, if we are able to achieve the Abuja Treaty to make sure that the African Economic Communities become a reality, we are sure that there is no other power in this world than Africa that will shape the future of the world. And I am convinced that we can shape the future of this continent and certainly influence and become, as it is written there, an African, community that will shape the global world order. So thank you for the questions, and I would really like to appreciate those questions and let you know that the AUC, if you see it weak today, or if it appears to be weak today, because we are not weak at all. I can speak this, and I'm speaking this way everywhere I go. You might hate me, but we will continue doing our job. I am lecturer at university. We don't care about what we say. I am not a politician. I am not a diplomatic person. I don't know that kind of language. We have to speak the truth. We have to speak what will unleash the potential of this continent. No matter how the cost will be, we have to make sure that we are able to move forward and to achieve what we want to achieve for this continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. As we're running out of time, I'll just give one panelist an opportunity if there's any final remarks in just 1 minute or 2 minutes. I would be happy for anyone to contribute to the end. Yes.
Yeah, I think a lot has been said, but I want to throw it back to the civil society in rethinking, to put ourselves in the rethinking mode. For a long time, we have complained about political will. What is it that we are doing to enhance that political will? When shall we start filling those political spaces to make sure we influence the decisions at the table, having acquired the vast experience, the vast technical expertise that we get from conferences and all that? When we leave the political spaces to people that are highly overwhelmed, sometimes without even the very basic ability to even analyze budgets, even at the council level, we can only have an equivalence of what we are ushering into power. So as long as we have people that are making decisions at that table who don't have what it takes to deliver, it's garbage in, garbage out. So I would like to make an appeal to civil society leaders and experts to begin to think about how best can we influence. Is it enough just to influence by being in the civil society? Or probably time has also come for us to begin to join the political circles and influence by being at that table. I think this is a take-home message I would want to send. I personally am tired of us accusing politicians of being corrupt, thieves, corrupt. Where are the people that are not corrupt to enter into that space and make things change? So probably it is also time for us to rethink about our roles. We have operated from the outside for too long. Maybe it's time to come in and then sit at that table, be the ones driving the agenda, and then we can ultimately have the highest political will that we have been dreaming of for many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. That's a wonderful note to end the discussion. On behalf of Development Reimagined and AfCoDD, I really want to thank you all for your very insightful contributions and to all the hard work that you're doing to enhance borrower coordination and putting African voices first. We truly appreciate and we thank the work that you do and hope that we can continue to work to do so in the future. Thank you.